Hello everyone and welcome back to The City Beneath, a roguelite dungeon crawler in vanilla Minecraft. Today I am incredibly excited to start taking you through the first dungeon of the map and to give you some insights into the design decisions that I'm making along the way. So without further ado, let's enter the Forest Dungeon. Up until this point, the player spent a bit of time in the cavern hub, fighting monsters and exploring, but for the most part, life has been pretty good. The cavern is truly about recovery and safety in preparing the player. But what are we preparing the player for? Well, that would be the dungeons. The dungeons are full of monsters and puzzles and will pose a great threat to the player. I died so much testing this map. And that's what this devlog is all about. How do you design a good dungeon? One that balances agony and reward? Well, up front let me tell you, I have no magic words or formula that will reward you with a perfect dungeon every time. However, I can share with you some tips and tricks I picked up along the way and hopefully inspire you in your projects as well. I'm going to walk through some of my design process and how I went from ideas in my head to the build on the screen. Let's go. Before I started the map, I had a good long look in the mirror and promised myself a few things. Number one, I promised to keep my scope down. Scope is the term used for quantity of features added to a project. The goal with low scope is to keep the quality of the features you do add high, ending up with a high quality and polished product overall. The next thing I promised myself was I needed to plan out the routing through the dungeon before I started the map. I sometimes tend to start projects without planning them out very well, and that rarely leaves me with a finished product at the end, so a bit of planning was certainly required. And finally, I made myself promise to have fun with it. I can get overwhelmed with a lot of tasks to perform, so I made sure to make a clear list of what I wanted to do, and I took it one task at a time. No burnout required. And now with my promises made and kept, well, mostly, scope creep is a menace. I began the dungeon with the entrance. A good entrance is very important in transitioning the player from one area to another. I really want to drive home the idea that the player is not entering a more dangerous area than they have encountered so far. For that, I chose to have the player move down deeper into the ground and have them walk nearby a waterfall. At this point, the player may or may not have encountered water yet, and if you don't know, water in this map is toxic. If they haven't encountered water yet, I want them to right now, to give them a bit of a warning of what's about to come. To incentivize them to learn their lesson, I have a small cave back here with a loot barrel. Nobody can resist a loot barrel. After that, we enter the main room and are presented with a completely brand new view. First, the room is full of trees. There are a lot of trees in here, and a lot of the challenge of this level will just be navigating a forest. Second, it's dark again. The darkness will play a role in the danger of the level as well. Next, across the way, there is a bit of light shining on the hill. Candles in this map tend to denote points of interest, however, the player will not be able to reach this area until later. This idea of signposting an interest point without allowing access yet can be a method of instilling curiosity in the player. I mean, I'd be curious about the light on the hilltop surrounded by a dark forest. And finally, once the player has jumped down off the platform, there's no way to get back up. Entering the dungeon is a permanent decision until they complete the boss or die trying. Hey, if you like this kind of devlog map making content and think other people would like it too, then give this video a like to let YouTube know that I'm doing a good job. Simple acts like this can really give small creators a huge boost. Thank you. This takes us now to the main room of the dungeon, the forest. The forest contains a set of linear tasks that drag the player all throughout it. Without giving away all the solutions, a few examples of tasks are extinguishing this campfire, navigating this marshland, and unlocking this forest well with a key. When I set out on this dungeon, I wasn't really sure what the puzzles would ultimately be, and I just let the design of the environment influence those decisions. The part of this dungeon I spent the most time on, and that really surprised me with its difficulty, was laying out the paths. I could not figure out how to make a forest both have to be navigated and also linear enough for puzzles to work out. I really wanted it to feel like the player just had to follow random trails in the forest, and I think I was able to mostly get that feeling by the end, but my strategy kind of went like this. Attempt some paths, remove those paths. Look on YouTube for D&D map making techniques. Try those out in a test world, remove those paths. lie in bed staring at the ceiling for a while. Try to make more paths. Hate them. Play an RPG for ideas. Be a failure at applying any of those ideas in your own game. Sit and stare at the ground for a while in silence because you can't draw lines on a piece of paper. And then have an epiphany. I was sitting in silence and asked myself how should it look to the player as they stood in the entrance of the dungeon. My answer was no straight lines of sight to anything. No matter where the player was, they should only have 2 or 3 options of paths and the rest should look like trees. At this point, something clicked and an image of a brick wall flashed into my head. The grout lines of a brick wall are nearly what I have been imagining the whole time but haven't been able to put into words. I would take the ideas of isolated wood sections and run paths through them so that you cannot see the other paths from the one you are on. With this idea in mind, I was able to put the first half of the dungeon in place. The backside of this main room is a bit different from the front. I created a marshland area of the forest that must be navigated to progress. There are a few items and locations in the marsh, so the player must leave and return a few times. This section killed me the most. In this back corner of the main room, I knew I wanted a tunnel section that would give the player access to a separate area for the mini-boss. Yes, you heard that right, this dungeon has 2 bosses. But we won't really be going over them in this episode. I'm going to save the enemies and bosses for the next devlog so I can give them the time that they deserve. But to get to the mini-boss, the player must enter this cave and navigate its dark depths. Here, the player will find treasure and a puzzle to grant them access to the swamp. The design for this swamp has been sitting in my notes from the very beginning of the map and I am so excited to finally build it. I absolutely love how this came out. I was inspired by a few things, but most notably the bayou from Pirates of the Caribbean. I love how the trees have overgrown the paths and are lit by the candles floating all around the area. Another source of inspiration was Corrales' swampy area in Hermitcraft Season 9. If you don't watch Hermitcraft, you're missing out. His build really inspired the walkways in this area. And of course, the mini-boss for this area will reside in the back corner of the room near the witch's hut, because the enemy is, of course, a witch. After defeating the mini-boss, one more puzzle can be completed in the main room that will lead you to the main boss chamber. The boss for this dungeon will consist of a highly health boosted zombie riding the back of a zombie horse. I designed the room in the classic boss room style of big platform in the middle and nowhere to run. The boss itself will again be talked about in the next video in way more detail. But I can tell you that the running idea at the moment is that when the zombie reaches half health, they will summon a few minions to carry out their bidding against you. This room was pretty straightforward to construct, and I am quite happy with how it has turned out so far. I am sure it will be tweaked as the boss fight is scripted out, however. Environmental hazards are a very important part of any boss fight, and this room only has a few scattered about it. I plan on creating a few more that are more themed towards the fight itself. But that ultimately does it for the design of the first dungeon. In the next video, we will add in enemy spawning into the main chamber and set up the scripting for the mini-boss and the main boss. Thank you for coming along and checking out the progress of the build, and I hope to see you in the next devlog. But until then, so long.